She smiled through her tears. Your Ineza has to go and see the doctor every other day. Otherwise she wouldn't be allowed to sing in the cabaret. Suddenly she put her hands over her face. Oh God, what have we done to deserve it all? First the NKVD and death always round the corner, and now this. I stood up and tiptoed out. There was nothing I could say. Down in the yard, Inesa's little girl recognized me and came running up in great excitement. Pan Erich, Pan Erich. I gave her the whole of my day's rations and stuffed her pockets full of rubles and marks. Remember me to Mamushka. The vehicle was roaring. Rostov had fallen, laid to ruins by an unusual massed attack by the Luftwaffe. Across its main street, a streamer was prominently displayed. Soldier beware, deadly Asiatic venereal diseases. Before our vehicle turned off to the big bridge across the Don, we stopped for a short while. We wanted to take a look at the places where we had taken quarters and were in position the previous December. The people were fearful. Rostov had been virtually destroyed by the Stukas. An Unterscharführer came out of a building whose roof had been burned away. I closed my eyes for a moment, but he had recognized me and approached me laughing. Walter, I said, confused, how is that possible? He took a deep breath and looked at his wristwatch. My leave train is heading home in 3 hours. I'll be using those 14 days, you can believe me on that. He joined us in the vehicle and rolled a cigarette with a jerky hand. He began to tell us his story. In the middle of the night, the spies shook us awake. His face was as white as a sheet. We're all goners, he stammered. Ivan's already in the city. We were up in a flash. The spies did not know much more than we did. We had never put on our uniforms as fast as we did then. Of course, the vehicle would not start. While the driver cursed and worked like a madman to get it started, a dispatch rider arrived. He had already been wounded. You won't be able to get out through there anymore, he yelled, and in fact, we actually heard small arms fire coming from the road in the direction of Taganrog to our rear. A cold chill went down my spine. An Untersturmführer, who apparently had also been asleep, linked up with us. Just keep your nerves, men, he said in an effort to calm us down. A round from an anti-tank gun howled on its way shortly above our heads, heading along the road and into the wall of a building. How impolite! The Untersturmführer laughed. That could backfire. In the middle of his sentence, he stopped and fell quite slowly to the ground. Medic! The spy yelled for no apparent reason, since a medic was already tending to the Untersturmführer. His entire chest had been opened up. Leave me alone, he sputtered out with some effort. Just get away. Naturally, we lifted the Untersturmführer onto the first vehicle that finally started. Our own vehicle continued to hold out for a while, but it also sprang to life eventually. There was heavy firing already raging on the next street over. In addition, there was a cold that took your breath away. Just as we were about to mount our vehicle, a burst of machine gun fire from a very short range landed right in our midst. Since I had not yet been standing on the vehicle, I didn't get scratched. All of the other comrades who were mounting up, about 8 in all, got hit. The spies collapsed with a cackle in front of my feet. He had been the father of 4 children. Get out of there, I thought to myself. Get out of there. I ran back into the courtyard and collided with someone. It was the blonde, Katyusha. In the place we were staying, you need to know, was also this blonde. I thought she was probably over 30, but I later discovered she was only 25. She had been very cold toward us, and I had barely spoken to her. Without a word, she took me by the hand and jerked me into the house. We didn't go up the stairs to the 2nd floor, however, where she lived. Instead, down into the basement. She led me all the way to the back of it, opened a small storage area and told me to lay down in it. She then covered me up with a couple of old canvas sacks and disappeared. So I was lying there with my pistol in my hand, ready to fire. I don't know whether it was the cold or the excitement, but I will not deny that I was shaking. Outside, they were firing like crazy. Suddenly, I heard a young, high-pitched and raised voice. Don't take a lot of time, you bastards. A few shots were fired, then it turned quiet. A few coarse bootsteps stamped down the stairs. I slowly raised my pistol. Although there was only a dim light in the basement, I immediately recognized the padded uniforms and the fur caps. All of a sudden, the blonde stood next to them and laughed. She said something and then approached me. So that's what's going to happen. The thought shot through my head in a flash. But then she turned around and left the basement with the Red Army men. Despite the cold, I was bathed in sweat as it became quiet in the basement again. A few hours later, the woman returned and brought me an entire loaf of bread. Then she indicated with a hand movement that I should remain quiet where I was. It was not until the next evening that she came again, bringing me some hot soup and some bread. This game was repeated for an entire week. I then turned feverish. I had caught a cold. Katyusha took my temperature with her hand and shook her head in a worried manner. That evening, she brought me 2 blankets and a bottle with hot tea and vodka. Despite all that, I believe I spent more than a week in the basement, half unconscious and dozing in and out. By the time I finally felt better, or forces had already pulled back some 80 kilometers, I was far in the Reds' rear area. One night, the Ukrainian woman brought me a wadded jacket and a fur cap. She hid my uniform cap, overcoat and tunic completely behind the sacks and took me up to her apartment. I was given a hiding place behind the beds in which Katyushka and her old mother slept. I spent the entire day there. It was only at night, when the apartment was locked up and the windows carefully covered, that I was allowed to crawl out of my hiding place. I was there month after month while she went to work at an armaments factory as a bookkeeper. I was literally buried alive. Only the old mother of Katyushka knew of my existence. Then, suddenly, the front started to get closer again, and all of Rostov was swarming with Red Army men. All agitated, Katyushka took me back down to the basement one night. She feared soldiers would be quartered in her building. Toward morning, I awoke, startled. An ear-deafening thunder filled the room. Stukas were bombing Rostov. The entire building was shaking and trembled like a ship in a storm. The 2 women, I thought to myself, agitated. I wanted to head upstairs when a direct hit put an end to all my thoughts. When I awoke, it was broad daylight. Light was falling into the basement through a gaping hole. Infantry small arms fires and the creaking of tanks' tracks could be distinctly heard. "More to the right!" a voice shouted outside. I shuddered as if a bolt of lightning had hit me. The words had been in German. I bellowed loudly for help, and they actually heard me. "Move back!" one of them yelled in. "We'll open up your cage." I felt my way back, and when the charge went off, I thought the air had been sucked out of me. But the crack was wide enough, and I was able to force my way through with some difficulty. Outside, I found myself looking into the rifle barrels of mechanized infantrymen from Viking, who were here going about their business. Stumbling, I made my report to the Untersturmführer with some difficulty. Then I wanted to take a look after the woman, but the house was a pile of rubble. There were no survivors. Then they interrogated me and I made a statement. "And now," he concluded, "it's time for leave." "Walter," I said as I slapped him on the shoulder, "you're one lucky guy." He looked at me and nodded. Then we shook hands in silence. He went to the local military administration headquarters and we moved on. We finally reached the Viking division, which was in the process of preparing to cross the Kuban. I was assigned to the tank destroyer battalion. We moved again through shoulder-high tobacco fields in full bloom, through sunflower fields and past waving grain. To me, it was a release when I found myself in the thick of heavy fighting a few hours later. The anti-tank battalion was composed almost entirely of self-propelled guns, armed with the former Russian 7.62 centimeter gun, a very respectable caliber. Unfortunately, they suffered from the disadvantage that they were as big as a barn door, being more than 3 meters high and just as long. Yet with all that, their armor was so pitifully thin that any anti-tank round went straight through like a knife through butter. We were in fact only protected against infantry weapons, and not even that completely, as number 1, the gunner, and number 2, the loader, were exposed in the back. We suffered many casualties as a result. We had reached the Maikop area, and the village ahead of us was held by the enemy, who hung on tenaciously and would not give way. We made a snap decision and set the thatched roofs alight to burn the enemy out. Within a few moments of opening fire with incendiary rounds, the first houses were on fire. The infantry then began to make good progress. In accordance with my orders, I moved my gun forward to the centre of the village square to cover the infantry attack against possible surprises from the south. But there was not a single enemy tank to be seen. I dismounted for a moment as the infantry. As I did so, an old woman ran out into the street from inside one of the burning houses, her hair straggling over her face, came up. "Germansky!" she called breathlessly. "Tell me, German, is there a god, Bogjest?" I stared at her and then nodded. "Da, Bogjest." The old woman turned triumphantly towards a group of younger women and youths and shouted with a very loud voice, "Here you are! Here's the first German. You must believe him. You've never believed what I told you. He says there is a God. God exists, and he'll make everything right again." I climbed back into my gun commander's position, and we moved on beside the advancing infantry as far as the end of the village. That was Russia. Their houses on fire, the world collapsing about their ears, and the old woman thinks nothing of saving herself or her belongings, because God is more important. God and the bearing of witness for him. How was one to rule this people with rational laws and programs? Unless, of course, by the methods of the Bolsheviks, of the system we were out to destroy. Our division then pressed on past Maikop, high up into the mountainous country above Tuapse, where it was to act as a covering force. In fact, we seemed as if we were on rest and relaxation. A blissful calm existed up there in the northern Caucasian forests. The Soviets, who had been forced back against the high mountain slopes, where they were leading a wretched existence, were barely able to have any influence on our movements, let alone interfere with them. The people in this part of the world were poor, desperately poor, far worse nourished and clad than any we had seen elsewhere. They were mainly Russians from White Russia who had settled there as lumberjacks. Most of them lived in lumberjack colonies, pathetic clusters of small wooden cabins and tiny plots of land. Somehow, I could never quite make these people out, for with all their wretchedness, they had a streak of slyness and cunning. Altogether, they presented a startling difference from the cheerful Ukrainians, who, in spite of Bolshevism, were almost well off in comparison. With the exception of outpost skirmishes and combat patrols, there was not a lot happening. Despite the peace and quiet of life in the high forest, we were not sorry when we were suddenly pulled out and put on the road to the east again. Our positions were taken over by Alpine troops, part of those gallant and doomed formations, which were later almost completely bled white in vain, unfortunately, in the fighting round Tuapse. On again to the east, past Armavir and Prokhladny. Looking at a map was bad for the nerves. It showed that we were 3,000 kilometres from the frontiers of Germany. And still we were heading east. Rumour had it that we were to push right through to the Caspian Sea in order to turn the left flank of the Caucasus. But suddenly we found ourselves approaching the Terek, which we crossed in the dead of night over a wooden bridge. After a lull of several weeks, the Red Air Force was becoming active again and accompanying us day and night. So heavily camouflaged were our guns with small trees and branches that they looked like nothing other than travelling bushes. Once across the Terek, we came across a large village which struck us both for its neatness and cleanliness and for its complete lack of life. One of the houses, we noticed, had a shop sign written in German in elaborate Gothic print. Brotladen. Every house had a small rose garden in front and rose-covered arbours and hedges around it. The church gleamed a blinding white. We were in the last German settlement, Gnadenburg. At some time during the course of the 19th century, a religious sect had been founded in Württemberg by people who believed they could find the road to paradise. In order to safeguard their road, this sect asked permission of the Tsar to found a number of villages in and about this area, and he, being only too glad to get a few hard-working and industrious Germans in his country, readily assented. 7 large villages then rose in rapid succession along the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, across the Kuban and out here into the Caucasus. They were to act as rest stations for the German pilgrims on their journey to paradise. Then the flow of the faithful ceased, and like a handful of wind-strewn grain, these 7 villages remained in the middle of the Russian Empire, symbols at once of German sectarianism, German piety, and German industry. The people of Gnadenburg soon got on friendly terms with the Cossacks, and even with their neighbours, the Karachevs and Kabardines, to one of whose tribes they paid a yearly tribute, thus ensuring themselves against fire-raising raids of the fierce hill tribes. If anybody from outside ever had designs on Gnadenburg, Muslim Caucasians and German Christians fought side by side against the invaders. But the village had been swept clean by the NKVD, and there was not a single German woman or child to be seen. In the first few days of the war, 98 men of the village, along with the village schoolmaster, had been deported to the Ukraine, where they had been forced to dig tank trenches and construct defences. Led by their gallant schoolmaster, they had taken the opportunity provided by a surprise German attack to make their way across to the German lines, and had since served as interpreters and guides in many different German regiments. All 99 of them had come back home, standing hopelessly in front of their damaged, plundered, and now empty houses. They walked as if in a dream through stables and houses. They touched boards they had nailed tight a few years back. They stroked damaged crucifixes which their wives had brought with them into the marriage. Then they stood helplessly around in bewildered groups in the neat little village street. "My mother is 62, the schoolmaster said to me with an expressionless face. "Where did she die? Where is she starving and freezing at this moment? It is a heavy cross that God has given us to bear. I don't know what we've done to deserve it. Our whole lives have been spent in ceaseless labour and rectitude, like the story of Gnadenburg itself. But God must know what he wants. In all this madness of the last few decades, there must be someone who knows where we're heading." Shortly after leaving Gnadenburg, our mission became clear. To clear the old Georgian military road, the Grusinkaya Doroga, and then push on towards Vladikaukas, or Ordzhonikidze, as it had been renamed by the Bolsheviks, in order to open the road to Tiflis. Our hearts sank slightly at the sight of the high Caucasian mountains on the horizon, but we nevertheless approached the coming battle full of confidence. The next morning we were showered with leaflets among the bombs for the Red Air Force. These read, "Every one of you is marching to his death. The Caucasus will be the meat grinder of Hitler's armies." The men laughed and threw them away, or else put them to a more useful purpose, as we were very short of paper. I was in a better humour than I had been for a long time, because it looked as though the German command was trying to avoid making the same mistakes in the Caucasus as it had done in the Ukraine. Relations were particularly good with the Muslim tribes. Volunteer cavalry units were being raised all over the Caucasus, which later rendered valuable service as reconnaissance and even as small combat forces, and we were constantly seeing the green flag of the Prophet fluttering side by side with our own. A strict order was issued stating that the Caucasian tribes were our friends and that they were to be treated as such in all circumstances, even down to the most trivial things. Energetic propaganda was being directed at an attempt to foster mutual understanding with considerable success, except for a few minor cases. The men principally responsible for this intelligent and proper treatment of the Caucasian peoples were two political advisers attached to Generaloberst Kleist's staff, General de Cavalerie Köstrin and General de Cavalerie von Herwarth. Köstrin, who was the son of a German bookseller in Moscow, had spent his youth in the Russian capital. At the beginning of the Russian campaign, he had fallen into disfavour for having drawn attention to the true strength of the Red Army, and had then sat in the Grunewald, a forgotten man, until Kleist remembered him and asked for him to be detailed as his political adviser, an arrangement which turned out to be as much in the German interest as in that of the many Caucasian tribes, the Karachevs, Kabardines, Ossetians, Ingushts, Azerbaijanis, and Kalmuks. This historic country, in whose mountain villages the Promethean legend is as alive today as it was 1,000 years ago, has always been a problem child for the Russians. It was there that Shamil, the 19th century leader of the Muslim hill tribes, engaged in his epic lifelong struggle. It was also there that Russian divisions had to use tanks, artillery and aircraft to break the last resistance of the mountain hill tribes in 1934. This fertile and strangely beautiful country, which some say is the cradle of mankind, could not be made to submit to the men of the Kremlin. German tanks were rolling into this land of magic. Golden eagles described their eternal circles high in the deep blue sky. The black kite, most beautiful of all Caucasian birds of prey, swooped down inquisitively on our lumbering columns. Falcons planed swiftly past, and wolves and bears drew back shyly into the endless forests at our approach. In the shadows of the Caucasian high forest, the black panthers peered down suspiciously on our Alpine troops as they hoisted the German flag on the steep mountain crests. We received our first classes concerning the civil population. One of the most important things to remember was never to express admiration. It is a risky thing to say to a Caucasian, "What are a nice-looking pair of trousers?" or "What a lovely horse." The owner will instantly present it to you, however precious or valuable it may be, expecting, of course, an equally valuable gift in return. To fail in this is regarded as a breach of etiquette and resulted in a serious loss of face. Much as we were amused at these instructions when we first received them, we were grateful enough for them later. For example, I was invited to a banquet by the Ossetian in whose house I was quartered. Fortunately, I was careful to seek advice as to the correct behavior before I went. When the dish arrived on the table, it was a whole roasted lamb. My host ceremonially cut off the head and handed it, as a mark of respect, to me as his guest of honor. I then, equally ceremonially, passed the brain back to my host and his wife. Obviously surprised by such excellent manners, my Ossetian host bowed. But when I then proceeded to cut off the left ear and pass it to the eldest son, I was really accepted, and from that moment on, the whole village regarded me as a man of the world, as somebody who knew how things were. But unfortunately, not everybody took the same precautions. At the end of the month-long fast of Ramadan, the Karachevs of Kislovodsk gave an immense and magnificent Bayram feast for the German armed forces. A representative of the Ministry for Eastern Affairs came over from Berlin specially for the occasion. One can imagine our horror when he began to hold forth in a booming voice after the feast. "Men and women of the Karachevs, we, the German people, have liberated you from the shackles of Bolshevism. You are now free. But that does not mean you can do as you like. You must show yourselves worthy of your new freedom and get to work. You must rub your hands together and get at the enemy. This is not the time to hang it up." And so it went on. Though not word for word, this is a fair, if somewhat toned-down rendering of the homilies of this gentleman, who, with his gorgeous brown uniform, liberally plastered with braid, was gazed at spellbound by his Karachev hosts. To our great good fortune, they had not understood a word, though the thundering voice and sweeping gestures had obviously made a deep impression. Then Rittmeister Baron Hahn, who had been detailed to act as interpreter, rose to his feet and, accompanied by the knowing smiles of the other interpreters present, gave a brilliant translation of the speech in a form completely acceptable to the Caucasian mentality. It ran more or less like this: Karachevs. Word came to us long ago that here in the High Caucasus was a worthy and noble people, the Karachevs, so we thought long and hard how best we could help you. And now our Führer has sent his armed forces and liberated you, and so on in the same style. When he sat down, the Karachevs burst into frenzied applause, and their elders assured us that they would do all they could to help us. We sighed with relief. Had the speech of the gentleman from Berlin been translated literally, it would have been considered a gross insult and might well have led to political disaster in the Caucasus. The political expert from Berlin was immensely surprised at the laughter that greeted him when he later said conceitedly, pumping out his chest, "You see, gentlemen, that's the way to talk to these people. That's the language they understand. It hits home." No one said anything. It would have been too dangerous. Moreover, the mentality of these Caucasian tribes offered us tremendous opportunities, though it needed an ability to empathize and a certain amount of sensitivity. This was strikingly demonstrated by the case of the special advisor to the Kalmucks, whose name I shall not mention as he is now living in the eastern zone of Germany. This brilliant and enterprising ethnic German from the Sudetenland devoted himself unsparingly to the cause of the Kalmuk tribes and induced in them such confidence that they were soon prepared to submit their problems unconditionally to his judgment. Among his friends and acquaintances, he became known as the King of the Kalmucks. None of us took our friend's work very seriously, looking on it rather as a personal avocation. One can imagine our surprise, therefore, when a delegation of Kalmuk elders appeared at von Kleist's headquarters one day to inform him that all the elders had sent orders through underground channels to their tribesmen in the Red Army to return at once to the Caucasus in order to fight on our side against Bolshevism. They also said that the Buddhist Kalmucks had even sent messengers to Tibet to inform the Dalai Lama of events in the Caucasus and to advance Germany's interests there. This was far more fruitful work than the interminable discussions that took place over what was to be done about the mountain Jews of Dagestan, once we had taken its capital, the Caspian port of Makhachkala. In about the year 1000, a number of larger mountain tribes living in the Dagestan, which are the highlands of eastern Caucasia, became converted to the Jewish faith, although by race and ancestry they were purely Aryan. Though remaining faithful to their newly adopted religion, they avoided all racial intermixture, and so were, beyond all doubt, genuine Aryan Jews. Ethnologists even went so far as to say that they were directly descended from the Goths. So what were they? Aryans or Jews? Were we to class them as friends or enemies? Military developments relieved our theorists of any such moral quandary. We never got to Dagestan. In general, our handling of the population in the Caucasus was 100 times better than it had been in the fertile plains of the Ukraine, where the first partisan groups of any size were just then beginning to make their appearance. In fact, I did not know that Koch and Sokol were just starting their wholesale conscription of labour throughout the eastern territories, and that the Caucasus was in fact the sole praiseworthy exception along all of the Eastern Front. Gun. We knew none of that. All we knew was that we were moving into position at Kishny Kub. My gun was well camouflaged, being half dug into a deep gully, and we had spent the night free from the attentions of enemy aircraft. When the runner came to wake us in the morning, all 5 of us were already up and about. Our Hein, a young soldier from Schleswig-Holstein, pulled me aside for a moment. I was surprised because for all his youth, Hein was already an old warrior, and it is usually only raw troops who hand over letters for home before a battle. Hein held out 2 photographs, each of a girl, one very pretty and the other rather plain. "Which one do you think I ought to marry?" he asked. "That's a hell of a question to answer on an empty belly," I said, trying to dodge the issue, because I knew that as far as Hein was concerned, my judgment was infallible. "What about this one? What do you think of her?" He held out the plain one. "Looks reliable," I answered, for want of anything better to say. The 19-year-old boy's face brightened. "That's exactly what I think. She's had a child by me, and she's always writing and sending me parcels. She's so worried about me. I've decided to write to my old man today. I want the boy to go on the farm if I should ever pack it in." We laughed. Then came the order. "Start up the engines." In a few minutes we began to move, and immediately there was activity in every defile. I had not realized the night before just how big our force was. There must have been at least 100 armoured vehicles of all sizes. All of Mühlenkamp's battalion was there. Our company, the 3rd Anti-Tank Company, was located somewhere about the centre of the force, safe enough. But we had not gone far from Nizhny Kub when we received the order. The company was to close up to the lead tanks. Up front, after all, our usual luck. Everything was still quiet, and we rolled on forward over hills and through deep defiles. Suddenly, a thunderous crash from far ahead shattered the peace of the morning air. Very heavy calibers. The shells were already impacting. A wide and deep tank trench gaped across our path just ahead. Armoured engineers dismounted from their vehicles and calmly worked their way forward with their demolition charges. There came a smart rap against the side of my crew compartment. So there were infantry there. That was something we had not expected. They were dug deep shafts in the gullies, which were overgrown by tall mountain grass, and were holding out there. No muzzle flashes could be seen, but there was no mistake about the sound of bullets. Fascinated, I watched through my sights as a tall Oberscharführer walked forward through the hail of fire, completely without cover, and attached charges against the wall of the tank trench. There was a sudden crash. The bastards had shot up my scope. By the time I raised my head above the gun shield, the Oberscharführer was gone, torn literally to bits by a shell. The next man crawled forward and lit the fuse. Then I saw him give a jerk, roll over and lie still. Meanwhile, bullets were whistling close overhead, and I had to get my head down. An enemy section was obviously giving us special attention, probably because, being on the extreme left flank, we offered the best target. Heavy shells were now dropping around us continuously, and I looked enviously at the tanks closing their hatches, while we remained exposed above and to the rear. Then the first charge went up, and a moment later the second, and then another. How the sappers had done it in the face of such fire was a mystery to me. The first tanks were already making their scion Viking. He was awarded the Knight's Cross on the 3rd of September 1942. He later served as the acting commander of the division, where he received the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, and ended the war as the Inspector General of the SS Panzer Forces. Way across the ditch, which had not been able to hold up our attack, following close on their heels, my gun lurched down and then up again. On the way up, I saw to my horror that 2 of our tanks were already on fire, either from direct hits or mines. But I had no time to lose. Shells were falling all around us. I continually shifted position and varied speed during the advance, using every possible maneuver to decrease the danger. Suddenly I felt something wet on the back of my neck. It was blood. I felt again, but I wasn't wounded. Then I saw blood, deep red blood, dripping through the crevices round the gunner's position. I shouted through the intercom to the gunner, "Are you wounded, Karl?" "No, not me," he answered, and then a second later his voice came again. "It's Hein. Pass me a field dressing. Quick!" I handed him up the first aid kit, but a little later he said in a low voice, "I think he's had it. I've already used 5 dressings. Hein's unconscious." "Watch out!" I shouted. "Keep your head down!" I had barely finished speaking when I heard him cry out. I promptly pulled myself up by the gun shield and with a wild somersault landed on top by Karl's side. He'd been hit fairly harmlessly in the jaw, but Hein was in a bad way. An explosive bullet had torn open his lower belly. After dressing Karl's wound, I shoved the first round of HE into the barrel, had the gun roughly swung round and then fired at the nearest defile. And then again. The enemy fire actually did slacken a little, although I had to fire in the blind. Suddenly the radio operator, who also manned the hull machine gun, shouted, "Something moving over there!" He swung his machine gun and fired several bursts. Then, cursing, he stopped. One of the invisible snipers had put a bullet through his right arm. I jumped down back to the gun commander's position and gave him a field dressing. Then we stopped by the commander's vehicle. Hauptsturmführer Erck was furious. "Get back as fast as you can and wait at the combat trains. You'll find them near Nizhny Kub." We swung round and moved out at top speed. I was surprised to discover that we had advanced a good 9 kilometers and that the infantry was still way back at Nizhny Kub. As we moved back by ourselves, the whole countryside seemed to spring to life suddenly, and we were met by a hail of fire. Red Army soldiers appeared from every nook and cranny. Despite his wound, the radio operator opened up with the machine gun and fired into the thick of them, leaving a trail of bodies behind us. I sat at the rear of the gun with Karl, taking turns with the submachine gun and throwing hand grenades, which we simply threw behind us. One of them went straight down a hole, and a Red Army man was hurled out of it a moment later. There was one man who trotted along quite carefree behind us, carrying an anti-tank mine, which he was apparently determined to throw at our gun. I actually had a liking for him. He kept it up so cheerfully and indefatigably, completely undeterred by the sting in our tail. But he meant no good, and had to be dealt with. At last we saw the first buildings of Nizhny Kub, and I asked for directions to the main dressing station. Hein was still alive when we lifted him out, but he was gone by the time the doctor bent over him. Shaken, I received his effects, among them the 2 snapshots. His letter had remained unwritten. The 2 wounded members of my crew remained at the dressing station. It was not easy to leave them. "Just my damned luck," Karl kept repeating angrily. The radio operator several times asked me not to be angry with him, saying that he would much rather have stayed with the gun. Tired and depressed, the driver and I moved out and found the combat trains not far away in a defile. Just as we decided to get some sleep, the first bombs came screaming down. Towards evening, 3 replacements reported for duty as the new gun crew. Shortly afterwards, the spies came over and instructed us to accompany the ration trucks up to the front after it got dark. After some minor skirmishing on the way, we eventually arrived back at the front with the 2 heavy trucks to find that our battalion had formed a hedgehog, and a huge field of maize in the meantime. We had hardly arrived when the first salvos of Stalin organs came down miraculously, without causing the slightest damage. I slept soundly and without dreaming. We were underway again at dawn. The wide valley lay shrouded in mist, and the peaks of the hills glowed fiery red. Off to our left front, the oil town of Malgobek began to take shape against the slopes of the Drehugelberg. A large white house stood out from the darkness, caught by the first rays of the rising sun. The squat fuel tanks were still hidden in shadow. Below in the valley, to the right of Malgobek, was Sakopchin, standing like a sentinel in front of the narrow defile that formed the gateway to the Georgian military road. For how many hundreds or even thousands of years had soldiers marched, driven or ridden down this road? How much blood had seeped into this fuel-sodden soil? The sun hung large and red in front of us, and the mechanized infantry riding into battle on their vehicles hummed the age-old soldier's song of a red dawn, lighting the way to an early grave. A T-34 swung into view about a mile in front, then another. Our leading tanks halted, and a round screamed through the morning air. It was a direct hit, and the first Soviet tank burst into flames. We moved on at top speed, the first wave of tanks in front, with our 3rd company close behind them. Once again, we were the outside gun on the left flank. In front of us, 50 Russian tanks swung into view. Then there were 100. There was general relief. The hour of decision had struck, and we were in for a major fight. The Russian armour was steadily reinforced as more and more tanks appeared out of the hiding places in which they had waited for us, from small defiles, from behind houses and haystacks. As they advanced towards us and opened fire, the hills around suddenly sprang into life. Artillery, anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns rained a fiendish hail of shells and rounds of all calibers into our midst. Great fountains of earth splayed up in the midst of our force. But there was no work for my gun yet. It was still quiet on the left flank. I critically observed the full length of my sector, including the town on the Drehugelberg, which was by this time slightly to the rear of our left flank. Suddenly, I saw a flash immediately to the right of the White House. A muzzle flash. Out of habit, I counted 1, 2, 3. At 5, the round landed 3 meters to our left, making the gun rock. I promptly changed position over to the left. Another flash from above, and I counted again. The round impacted at 5, this time about 10 meters away to our right. A moment later, the company commander raced past in his command vehicle, and I reported, "Enemy fire from Malgobek." He laughed loudly. "You're crazy. Malgobek's been in our hands since early this morning." Then he moved off, shaking his head at such ignorance on the part of a gun commander. Another flash from above, and I changed position again, this time moving backwards. The round landed on the exact spot we had been. Before long I was able to pick out at least 3 batteries firing on us from above. A little later the commander moved up again. "You were right, damn it. The infantry regiment that attacked the town this morning was badly cut up in its assault. You'd better open fire on the Malgobek batteries for the time being. There's nothing going on here anyway." We pivoted in place. By then, our driver down below was beside himself. "What the hell's going on up there? Are we turning tail?" There is nobody worse off in a tank engagement than the driver. With only his narrow vision port to look through, he can never see what is going on, and what is worse, can never get a real feel for the battlefield. At this point, of course, we were having to turn our unprotected rear towards the enemy attack. We then fired off round after round in rapid succession against the high ground. Our rounds were soon striking the White House, and then, at last, on the forward battery. We saw debris hurled into the air. All the time I was having to shift position at ever more frequent intervals, because the remaining enemy guns were obviously concentrating all their efforts on finishing us off. During a short pause in the firing, I took the opportunity to have a quick look round. Things were not looking too good, and there must have been some 30 of our guns and tanks on fire. There was also a healthy-looking bonfire over in the enemy's side, but to make that at least 300 T-34s were massing against us. Then the loader reported, 3 more 80 rounds left. Up 4, I stiffened up. In my firing fever, I had completely forgotten the need for economy and had fired off all our ammunition. Now we were in a nice mess. I manoeuvred immediately over to the commander to report. The commanding officer said nothing. I offered to move back and reload to the gunnels, but he shook his head. "The ammo carriers will be along any moment," he said. "Try to keep going as best you can until then, and don't stay too long in any one spot, or you'll be pinpointed." We raced around the battlefield for a while. Not a pleasant feeling having to hang around like a fifth wheel and act like a target in a shooting gallery for the enemy. A few minutes later, the driver reported laconically, "Fuel for another 10 kilometers at most." I looked around desperately for the ammo carrier, but it was still nowhere to be seen. In fact, it had been knocked out long before without our knowing it. The news about the fuel was the last straw. Could a piece of shrapnel have found our fuel tank? But whatever it was, it made no difference. We were finished. A little way to our left, I could see a shallow dip in the ground, and I had the gun moved to its deepest point less than 3/4 of a meter deep and halted there. "Well now, gentlemen," said the gunner with gallows humour, "make yourselves comfortable." I squatted down at my station and feverishly tried to think of a way out. No matter how hard I tried, I could think of nothing. A shadow fell across me, and I looked up and saw the number 2, a young recruit fighting his first battle, looking enviously at my station, which was better protected against shrapnel than his own. "Would you mind changing places?" I asked him quietly. "I want to come up top for a bit." He nodded quickly and clambered down while I went and hung out next to the gunner. He said nothing, and I also had nothing to say. We were both in our second year in the East, and we knew only too well what our situation meant. Next to the seat the recruit had left was a crumpled dime novel. I picked it up and opened it. The red light in the bar alternated with blue and green in a majestic play of colour. Soft music brought an atmosphere of delicate refinement. I smiled and read on. Shells were bursting all round us, and shrapnel screamed past in a frenzy of destruction, but I was sunk in my dime novel world. All of a sudden, I felt a terrific blow in the pit of my stomach and found myself hurtling upwards. For a split second, I saw the gunner flying beside me and a fiery hell below. By the time I hit the ground, I had realized that it was a direct hit. Lying dazed on the fuel-sodden earth, I caught sight of the young recruit trying frantically to extricate himself from the burning gun, but he fell back into the sea of flame as I jumped up. Exploding ammunition and grenades arcing upward forced me back to the ground. Close beside me I heard a low groan. I looked around and saw the company commander dragging himself along the ground, bleeding and dripping with sweat. "What's going on?" he asked faintly. I pointed to the burning gun. "How many rounds do you have in your pistol?" I did not understand. "The usual, 16? He pointed to the Soviet tanks, which had approached to within 200 meters and were swarming with mounted infantry. Our own tanks were rolling back. Just in front of us there was a narrow puddle filled with fuel about 1/2 meter wide and around 30 centimeters deep. We crawled through it. The commander was having a rough go of it. We later discovered that he had 14 small pieces of shrapnel in his shoulder, and our progress was painfully slow. Meanwhile, our tanks launched an immediate counterattack and managed to throw Ivan back almost a kilometer in spite of his superior numbers. In response, the Russian batteries redoubled their fire, which rose to a pitch of absolute frenzy, and with shells dropping in unbroken succession and shrapnel whistling and sizzling just above us, we did not even dare to raise our heads to look around. Eventually, we arrived at a depression, where we found the mechanized infantry had assembled. With a sigh of relief, we joined them. Saved! Shortly afterwards, a large formation of about 80 aircraft appeared on the horizon and approached us. Ours at last. It was about time. Another sigh of relief through the ranks. But then a brittle voice said, "They're Reds." It was true enough. We had not recognized them. They were American, part of the first deliveries of American aid to Russia. A second later, the first aircraft started its strafing run, and machine gun rounds began to strike in our ranks. Bombs screamed down and tore great gaps in the huddle of humanity below. During these few minutes or hours, that awful eternity, we lay rigid on our backs, with hands clenched, waiting for death. Wounded men cried out 20 yards in front of us, and again 20 behind. Many cried no more. They were the lucky ones. In. Then at last the skies were empty. 2 German fighters raced. 2 German fighters! You didn't know whether to laugh or cry. We has long since used up all of our field dressings. We then squirmed over the heaps of dead and wounded. The enemy fire had not abated for a second, and reached a gun from a neighbouring company which was damaged and on its way back. A few tank rounds followed us, but they fell short. I wiped the blood off my face, some of it my own from a few shrapnel scratches I had received, and some of it from my comrades. When I looked in a mirror, I recoiled in horror. My face was blackened all over from the explosion and slightly scorched by hot oil or fuel. I had noticed nothing. When the gun halted at Nizhny Kub, I fell off exhausted and remained where I had fallen. I was completely exhausted. But not so the company commander, Urk, who, in spite of his 14 pieces of shrapnel, picked up a couple of repaired guns from the maintenance company, found crews for them, and headed out to the aid of our hard-pressed comrades. A little later I heard the news that a close friend of mine, Fritsch, had been killed just beyond the tank ditch, the 30th man of my parent unit to go. Our division lost some 1,500 men in the fighting around Malgobek and Sakopchin, and the graves beside the tank ditch grew to a small city of the dead. A few days later, we again found ourselves in heavy fighting round Malgobek, which we at last managed to take. This town was the key to the whole position, and without it our attack had had little chance of success. I could not understand why the Russians had not simply taken a dozen tanks and a handful of infantry, and closed the fourth side of the wide valley, of which they already held the other 3. Not a single man of us would have got out. Shortly afterwards, a special assignment took me to Kislovodsk, yet another Russia. They were lovely, well-cared-for little towns from Tsarist times, with the addition, of course, of the usual monumental palaces of Soviet bureaucracy. Such were Yessentuki, Pyatigorsk, and Kislovodsk. In Pyatigorsk, the town where Lermontov had written A Hero of Our Time and was shot in 1841, and where Pushkin wrote his Caucasian Prisoners, I met friends from home. We talked and drank until dawn. From there I moved on into nearby Kislovodsk, where relations with the civilian population were obviously on a happy and normal footing, especially with the Muslims, who were well disposed towards us and intensely anti-communist. As I drove into the town, I encountered a Karachev cavalry battalion on its way to the mountains, singing and playing roughhouse. They were splendid, slender and bronzed men, who sat in the saddle as if moulded there. In Kislovodsk, I struck up a chance acquaintanceship with a number of professors from the university in Leningrad, mainly from the medical faculty. They had been evacuated from Leningrad to the Caucasus, probably in order to prevent any members of the Russian intelligentsia from falling into our hands. They were all working in German military hospitals. These men were serious older medical professionals, many of whom had studied in Germany and Vienna. Yet the stories they had to tell of Leningrad might well have come from the lurid imagination of a Dostoevsky. The city had been so badly supplied that a complete state of famine had set in only a few weeks after the beginning of the German siege. Dogs, cats and rats soon came to be regarded as delicacies beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Scenes of cannibalism, reminiscent of the Great Famine of 1921, were daily occurrences, and a man was barely safe from his neighbour. Deaths were kept secret for weeks on end, so that the next of kin or other people in the building could go on drawing the dead person's rations. The bodies lay rotting under the beds. Anybody sick or feeble who ventured on the streets was immediately surrounded by gangs of starving children or youths, as if by a pack of wolves. Anybody who had the misfortune of collapsing out of doors was immediately stripped of his clothes and shoes. there was a strict law that the caretaker of any house in front of which a person was found dead was responsible for burial. The result was that most caretakers maintained a constant watch, and the moment anybody died, promptly stripped the body of all its belongings and dragged it along to the next house, so as to burden the man next door with the work, which all had grown too weak to do. When the first evacuation trains finally left the dying town, the bodies of the people who died on the journey were simply heaved out of the window at every station. One could not travel with them, and the other passengers needed the space. The railway track was lined with naked corpses. "It was sheer hell," an old professor said, shuddering and covering his eyes with his trembling hands. "I don't know where we found the strength to survive it all. And it wouldn't really have been so difficult to supply the city with foodstuffs. But it was easier like this. Only the privileged and the army were needed alive. We were condemned to death, to a horrible, ghastly death." Most of the professors had lost many relatives in the charnel house of Leningrad. I left the Russian scholars' colony numb with horror. Measured against such an experience, even the bloodiest of battles lost half its terror. I wandered aimlessly through the streets. The strains of the balalaika filtered out from cafes and bars. Wounded soldiers paraded down the promenade arm in arm with Caucasian girls or Norwegian or Flemish nurses. In the dusk, the candles in the small Orthodox church flickered mildly inside the wide-open door. I hesitated a moment and then went in. There were a few worshippers, old men and women, down on their knees on the stone floor. God had given us a great mission, of that I was certain, a difficult but noble mission. If only we would realize it and prove ourselves worthy. May the giving German heart grapple with it and pour out all its strength in its discharge. May the blood of the millions of our dead be the seed from which eternal friendship with the liberated peoples of the steppes and the eastern mountains may spring to the benefit of all mankind. I went into a small bar where Caucasian and Mohammedan music was being played. The monotony of it had driven all German troops away, and the place was left almost exclusively to the locals. A Luftwaffe Hauptmann asked me if there was room at my table. Gradually we got talking. "You know, that's just how I feel about it," he said in a tone of relief. "I've just come back from leave in Western Germany, where my father-in-law runs a big ammunition factory. The Russian women workers there, most of them Ukrainians, are all housed in barracks surrounded by barbed wire. These wretched women, a lot of whom are even volunteers who were brought to Germany with grandiose promises, are kept cooped up like convicts, only being allowed out in pairs under escort, just like in an orphanage. It's complete lunacy. I did what I could to make people understand. But it's like drop of water on a hot stove." I was then posted to the Salt Steppe, which links the Kalmuk Steppe with the Caspian Sea, the country north of Mostok, Edisya, Stepnoy and Atshikulak. We were quartered in carpet-weaving villages, which had been founded by refugee Armenian settlers. During our stay there, we encountered a regiment of Cossacks, which was doing magnificent work against the enemy in that area. The few hours I spent with the old colonel of this regiment were an absolute tonic. This East Prussian officer, a man of some 60 years of age, was the idol of his Cossacks, whom he treated as equals. He could get anything from them. He treated them as human beings, and was, in turn, respected as a human being by them. A long time later I heard that this regiment, like the Kyrgyzian division, had been wiped out to the very last man after the death of its colonel. Not a single Cossack had surrendered, even though their position covering to the German retreat was hopeless. But at that time there was still no thought of retreat. Nalchik fell, the capital of the autonomous Soviet Republic of the Karachevs and Kabardines. Shortly after that, I was summoned home for the second time to spend another few months getting everything in the office back in order. This time I kept very quiet. The story I had been told by the Luftwaffe Hauptmann was fully confirmed by what I saw. In fact, conditions in some places were worse. After I had been back a week, Josef Burkel sent for me. "How's things in the East?" "Just as reported in the German Armed Forces daily reports," I replied laconically. He said nothing. "I see the Ukrainians are being treated like convicts. They came here to help us defeat Bolshevism and are now sitting behind barbed wire. They're worse fed than the German people, but are expected to do the hardest work. If that happens here, what do you think's going on in the East? Burkle quickly changed the subject, asking me about the morale of the troops and the fighting in which I had taken part. I gave him the straight truth. A few days later, I noticed that he had begun to make surprise inspections of the Ukrainian workers' housing and feeding arrangements. Some weeks later, I happened to see a confidential directive to factory managers to treat their workers from the East with humanity and justice. He became increasingly friendly to me every time we met, and we had frequent long conversations, almost invariably about the East. Hoping, as I was, for a new turn in the situation there, I soon found out that he was toying with a plan for replacing the nefarious Erich Koch in the Ukraine, a project which would have been wholly to Germany's good, but which never came to anything, being wrecked on the rocks of party intrigue. However, I was relieved that I had managed to win over at least one man, who, even if he was not in the top rank, undoubtedly wielded great influence.